You are listening to Parliament Matters, a Hansard Society production supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. Learn more at hansardsociety.org.uk/pm.
Welcome to Parliament Matters, the podcast about the institution at the heart of our democracy, Parliament itself. I'm Ruth Fox.
And I'm Mark Darcy, and we're delighted to welcome into the Parliament Matters studio Nan Sloane, who's a historian and author, and who's just produced a biography of an almost unknown political figure, Margaret Bondfield, Britain's first female cabinet minister.
Well, we'll come on to Margaret in a moment, Mark, but I think to describe Nan as just a political historian is to rather understate things. I mean, I've known Nan for many, many years now, and she's got a long history of activism in the Labour Party. She was regional director of the Yorkshire Labour Party for many years. But more importantly, I think she has run training for women candidates in the Labour movement for years. And I think probably single-handedly is more responsible than anyone for getting more women MPs into the Parliamentary Labour Party. And also runs, I think, Nan, that's right, you run the training programme under the Joe Cox Memorial Programme.
I lead a team on it, yes.
Yes, lead a team on it. Modesty itself, but welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, we're talking today about one of the pioneers for women in the House of Commons, a very appropriate subject. Margaret Bondfield was not only one of the early women MPs, but the first woman cabinet minister. And it's a bit of a mystery to me, Nan, why she's not better known. I mean, everybody knows, knows anything about Parliament, that Nancy Astor was the first woman MP to take her seat. Everybody who does pub quizzes knows that Constance Markievicz was actually the first woman to be elected to the House of Commons, even though as an Irish Republican she didn't take her seat. But Margaret Bondfield's almost invisible in that history. Why is that?
Well, I think it's a combination of reasons. There's the obvious one of her involvement in the 1929 to 31 Labour government, which ended in, as I'm sure we'll touch on later, a bit of a disaster and tainted the reputation of everybody involved in it. But I think there is a lot more than that. She was never involved with the suffrage, the female suffrage movement. And we tend to view the history of women in the late 19th and early 20th century almost entirely through that prism, either the very narrow prism of the suffragette movement or the broader one of the wider suffrage movement. And she was not involved in that. And more than that, she was actively hostile to it, not because she didn't think women should have votes, but because she thought everyone over the age of 21 should have a vote. And she wasn't prepared to campaign for votes for middle-class women if she couldn't also secure them for working-class women and working-class men. And as a consequence, some elements of the suffrage movement were very hostile to her. So when they came to writing their histories of it, either left her out altogether or were very critical of her. The route she came through into politics was almost entirely male. So she came through the trade union movement. There were very few women in the trade union movement. She was almost always the only woman present at lots and lots of things. And so she was, everyone knows if you're the only woman in a room, it's much harder to get your voice heard, much harder to get yourself on the record, as it were. I also don't think she was thinking that much about posterity at the time. She just wanted to get the job done.
She's not one of these people who left behind a well-ordered archive with sort of biographers start here somewhere in it.
If there's an archive, well-ordered, it's not necessarily the word I would use. So, yes, I think between all these different things, and also she was not young and exciting and romantic. When you read about people like Ellen Wilkinson, who are the next generation on, lots of speculation about her clothes and all the rest of it, which we might deplore, but at the time was... Whereas Margaret Bondfield was older, she didn't get into Parliament till she was 50. And so there was much less, it was a different kind of interest that people had in her.
You've travelled all over the UK and to America, to Vassar College, to look at her papers. What was the one single thing that stood out to you when you're looking through all of this massive material and you thought, wow?
Well, I would say there are two things.
I'll give you two.
I would say that there are two things. One, actually, is the series of letters written by Ethel Bentham, who was a doctor and subsequently a Labour MP in 1929, but who was Margaret Bonfield's doctor, who on one occasion when Margaret Bonfield had quite a serious breakdown, the woman I think was Margaret Bonfield's partner was trying to send her to a male psychiatrist. And Ethel Bentham was writing saying, on no account should you do this, because this was 1910. On no account should you do this, because A, it's a really bad idea, B, I don't like the psychiatrist you've chosen, C, it is offensive to me that you are doing this yourself and not asking me for a reference, it's unprofessional, and if you do this, her reputation will be irretrievably damaged because it will get out. And she doesn't specify what the it is, but it's clear from the context of the letters. And that series of letters is one of the few letters that she's preserved as original. So there are a lot of letters that are typed copy of destroyed originals, so you wonder what's missing from them. On these, she has kept the original, so it is Ethel Bentham's angry scrawl that you read. And so that was quite striking, both for the content, but also because they were original. And I think the other thing that I thought was particularly striking was the photograph that is in the book of her as a child with her brother and sister, because I've never seen that before or had any idea it existed. There's just something about her face on that is...
It's a very solemn little face.
It's a solemn little face, and that's a child who is already living not with her parents. And then over the page from that, there's her at 14, also very, not only solemn, but pretty annoyed. Which, if you were 14 and were put into that corset, you would be.
Yeah.
But I'd seen that picture, whereas the one of her as a child was quite... It just struck me as, I don't know what the word is, but it was just striking.
Yeah, a window on a not entirely happy childhood.
Yes. But was she later represented as having been very happy? And also not.
Give us a pen portrait of her. What was she like? What have you learnt about her as a sort of a personality? As you say, she's older, but what was she like?
Well, she was clearly, from what people say at the time, she was very charming, she was very able, she was very bright. Obviously, she left school at 13 and was very conscious all the time of her lack of formal education. But that didn't mean she wasn't intelligent. She was very good at friendship. She had a huge circle of friends who were very loyal to her and stayed with her even when things were very bad, which always says something. But she was also very stubborn. She could be very opinionated. She didn't like being wrong. And she, I think, didn't tolerate fools very well. And so there was a mix of views about her. Broadly speaking, though, people tended to want her involved in what they were doing and to think that she was an asset to the party and to the trade union movement. It's very difficult, isn't it, to project back into what a personality would have been like. But historically, I always think if the people you like the person you're writing about, it's possible that they were as you would hope they were. But I think you have to be realistic that we're all a mixture of good and bad and charming and infuriating, and she was no different.
I suppose it's a bit indelicate, really, but it is one of the questions that people ask about Margaret Bondfield. She never married, she never came close to marrying, she didn't seem to have many close male friendships. Was she a lesbian?
I think almost certainly she was. People usually like to frame this as, because she says something herself about deciding early on that she didn't want to get married and her life was in the unions and the love of comrades and things. And I think that's capable of more than one interpretation. I think that the pattern of her life suggests certainly that all her close emotional relationships were with women. She certainly had at least one woman with whom she had a long-lasting relationship, and they lived together for a number of years and remained close for the rest of their lives. She, as you say, never married, but never had any inclination to marry, and I think was a lesbian, and I think suffered considerably from the need to conceal that, because at the time, obviously homosexual acts were illegal, but lesbianism was not. But it was considered a form of arrested development, and that if you were a lesbian, your emotional and intellectual development was arrested at about the age of 14 or 15, when you had crushes on other women and it was all very girlish and, immature. And obviously for somebody who was a serious person and had aspirations, that was not a perception of her that she would have wanted people to have. For middle-class women, I think it was easier, but when you were already a working-class woman in environments in which class was an issue, to add sexuality to that was going to be difficult. And she was prone to breakdowns all her life, sometimes prolonged, sometimes not. And I think the pressure of having to appear to have no emotional life at all, at the same time as she clearly was, from the bits of her diary that survive, very emotional and very sometimes overwhelmed by what she felt. It was incredibly difficult, and I think we owe it to her to recognise that that was part of the challenge. Even if she did not have sexual relationships, the fact that her emotional impulses were towards other women would have been considered immature and unacceptable in somebody running a country.
And was this one of the reasons why so little of her personal papers survives? Did she consciously set out to expunge the evidence?
Yes. And it is noticeable in the archive that that is what is missing, is that dimension of her life. And I think that's very sad. Whether I'm right or not about her sexuality, I think it's very sad that she felt the need to conceal it.
The story starts with her growing up around Chard in Somerset,
Yes.
in a family that is pretty poorly off. They have a little bit of land. It's okay when the parents are in work and the wider family's got jobs, but when people die and problems occur, then there's a very rapid plunge into something much closer to outright poverty.
Yes, I think like a lot of families at the time, and probably still, they lived very close to the edge, and it took very little to tip them right onto the edge. There is a difference between urban and rural poverty, and when people talk about her being brought up in poverty, people think of, back streets and all that kind of thing. And in terms of physical surroundings, she was actually quite lucky. It was a cottage with, as you say, a bit of land, there was a garden, although Chard had a lace industry and factories where her father worked. It was a rural area, and so there is much more concealed poverty. They could grow food in the garden.
It was picturesque poverty. Yeah.
It was picturesque poverty. And people say a cottage without thinking there was no running water, there was no heat or light beyond wood and paraffin. So it sounds picturesque. And it is. I mean, I've been and had a look at it. It is very pretty. But you wouldn't want to bring up that number of children in it. 11 children.
Yeah, she was part of a big family.
Yeah.
And
everybody was. So.
And actually spent quite a lot of time away from her parents.
She did, which again was not uncommon at the time. If you were, aristocratic or middle class, you sent your children off to school. And if you weren't, you farmed them out on your relatives. And she was sent, when she was about 4.5, 5, to live with her grandmother and older sister, who had already been sent at a much earlier age to live with the grandmother, and did then not go back to live permanently with her parents until she was 10, and was shipped round to, brother in Brighton and so on and so forth. That sounds awful to us. We would not put an 8-year-old on a train with a label on her coat and send her from Chard to Brighton on her own, would we?
And very rapidly, as you say, she left school at 13. She was very rapidly working in shops, and that was an extremely low status employment for a young woman. And more than that, it was incredible. I was really struck by this in the book. The working conditions were incredibly bad.
They were appalling, but it's worth saying that how she got there is a demonstration of something that runs all through her life, of she took risks. So when she left school, the preferred occupation for bright working class girls was teaching, because the 1870 Act had opened up a whole demand for teachers that they couldn't fill fast enough. And the 1880 Act, which made school attendance compulsory, opened it up even further. And so parallel to the development of all the board schools, there was a development of a teacher training structure which gave working class girls from the age of 14 what we would now consider a good secondary and first year or so of higher education, gave them a profession with decent pay, and also gave them really good marriage opportunities, which was a thing at that time and less of a consideration now. And her sister Harriet had already gone through this route and married a civil service clerk. And so her parents naturally thought, right, well, off she goes. But you couldn't actually get into that system until you were 14. So the year between leaving school and being 14 was normally spent in the local board school teaching the local children. And she had 42 boys to teach reading and writing to.
Wow.
Small boys, but still, 42 of them. And at the end of it, she just said, no, I'm not doing this. No circumstances in which this is going to be my life. And then her parents didn't know what to do with her and shipped her off again to her sister in Brighton. And by chance, her sister's friend had an opening for an apprentice, and she took it.
And tell us a bit about those conditions as a shop worker in that era.
Legally, you were a servant. You were classed as a domestic servant. And so shop work was outside the remit of all the industrial legislation, and in particular outside the remit of the Truck Acts, which had banned payment in kind. So shop workers were largely paid in kind in the form of accommodation, food, medical services, which most of them said they never received. So it's supposed to be a very benevolent sort of environment. And in fact, of course, it was awful because employers provided the absolute least possible. Accommodation was usually a dormitory in which you had a bed and a box for your things and nothing else. Your life was controlled absolutely from the moment you got up to the moment you went to bed. You needed permission to leave the building. You needed, not just, during working hours, and working hours were often 10 hours a day, 6 days a week. But if you wanted to go out on the evening, you needed permission. You would have a time at which you had to be back. And this is adult men and women. And if you didn't comply with all of these things, you would be fined, and you could be fined for the smallest thing. My favourite example of the employers getting round regulations, the few regulations that there was that there was in the 1890s, a big thing about shop workers having serious back and hip problems because they were standing all day, every day. And so Parliament passed an act that said there should be one seat provided, one chairs provided for every 3 shop workers, but it didn't specify that the shop workers should be allowed to sit on them. And so the seats were provided, but the customers sat on them while the shop workers stood all day. So it was a really hard, horrible life, and it's hardly surprising that most of the women in it just wanted to marry somebody and get out.
I was really struck that not only were they not paid very much, but that a lot of what they were paid was clawed back in fines anyway, and that was presumably quite conscious. That was how you kept the whole bill down.
When Margaret Bondfield moved to London, she was paid £15 a year, London wages obviously were higher than elsewhere. £15 a year, less deductions.
This experience, she starts out as an apprentice in Brighton. She starts out initially in quite a decent environment, a family shop. She's treated as a member of the family. It's a very different situation. But then the head of the family dies, her apprenticeship can't be completed and she has to go elsewhere, and she's exposed then to these terrible conditions. And it really sort of drives her sense of injustice from that point on. And she gets involved in activism in sort of the trade union movement. How does she come into that?
Not in Brighton. I think the majority of shop workers had no idea there was a union or that they could join a union, or would have joined a union had they known, because shop workers tended, despite all the appalling conditions, to think of themselves as a cut above manual workers, and unions were for manual workers and not for the likes of them. When she moved to London, she must have known there were unions because her brother was active in the printers union. One of her brothers, Frank, was active in the printers union. So she must have been aware that such things existed, and also she was capable of reading a newspaper, but didn't think of it in terms of her. And then at lunchtime one day, she went out and bought a bag of chips to eat for lunch because the food at the shop was so awful. And it was wrapped in newspaper, and on the newspaper there was a letter from the secretary of the Shop Workers Union saying, we need people to come and join because we can do something about wages and conditions. And she thought, well, I haven't got anything to lose, I might as well do that. And so...
And that's how it starts, literally.
That's literally how it starts.
Chip paper.
Chip paper, yes.
Extraordinary.
Chip paper in Fitzroy Square. There were hardly any women in the Shop Workers Union at the time, so what they thought when she turned up, knowing absolutely nothing, and going, yeah, I'm up for sorting some of this out.
And she took quite a role in doing that. She became a kind of, not exactly mystery shopper, but mystery employee, going around and working in different places and detailing what went on in terms of bad employment practices. She put all this in a series of articles under a pseudonym as well. So she was publicising how bad it was.
She didn't write the articles. A well-known campaigning journalist wrote the articles. She supplied all of the information for the articles. So she started off in quite high-end shops and made a note of all the things that were going on there, and then either resigned or got herself fired and moved on. So by the end she was in real poor East End shops. And it was, in fact, a very brave thing to do, because by the time she finished, she was unemployable because she'd had so many jobs in the space of 2 years, and her references had got worse and worse every time she moved on. And so she was then unemployed. She knew from the outset that would be the consequence of doing it, but they thought this was the only way they could get people to take any notice of the conditions of the people they were encountering every day in shops, and particularly in the high-end shops.
I mean, as you say, you know, there's this appetite for risk that would perhaps have been unusual at that time. She then goes on in terms of trying to develop and build the union membership. So she's worked on the evidence base, if you like, and the publicity for the problems, but then she's trying to grow the size of the union. So she takes on a really sort of even more a peripatetic existence, travelling around the country, speaking at events and campaigning. And what was that like?
I think she thoroughly enjoyed that. She turned out to be a really gifted public speaker. Nowadays, we think that was unusual in a woman. In fact, there were loads of women going around speaking about various things. Obviously, there was both sides of the suffrage movement, but there were also the Independent Labour Party had a whole fleet of women lecturers who went round the country. Religious organisations had women, particularly the Congregational Church had women preachers. So it was not unusual. It was unusual in a trade union context. And she was tiny. She was 5 foot and in her youth very slim and young looking for her age. So lots of awful comments about a tiny little slip of a girl amongst all these men. So she enjoyed that. Once she realised she could do it, she enjoyed it. And she didn't so much like going into shops and trying to recruit people, because she had to be very careful, because you could be fined or sacked for any contact with a trade union. And so she had to make sure she wasn't actually getting people into more trouble. So she'd sort of sneak a leaflet in and then meet somebody outside and then organise a meeting away from the shop. But she always enjoyed travel. She liked movement. She liked different places. She liked meeting people, and she liked feeling that what she was doing was making a difference. So although it must have been really wearing, she was in her 20s, and she was young and keen, and enthusiasm took her through some of the less happy bits, I think.
You mentioned religion. Was she terribly religious?
She was religious. She was spiritual. She would consider herself Christian. She is nonconformist. But when she took up trade union work, which meant she couldn't go and sing in the choir every Sunday, the church had her in and said, you can't do both, you have to choose. Trade unionism is not compatible with church. She chose the union and didn't go to church again for 20 years.
Correct.
So
Okay.
She went back in the war, the First World War, as many people did. But in between, the union was always her absolute priority.
And she was making her way higher and higher through the union movement as she went along, with a variety of paid posts as organisers for a variety of organisations. And she was able to do that even in a movement that was not, how can I put it delicately, not notably woman-friendly.
No, it wasn't woman-friendly at all. And in fact, TUC had spent several years trying to make sure that women were banned from attending.
There's an occasion where she's the only delegate at full TUC.
In 1899, she's the only female delegate, and that's when the resolution to found the Labour Party was moved. So she was the only woman to speak on that particular debate. And one of the penalties of being the first, she wasn't the first woman to be a delegate to TUC, but one of the penalties of being the first woman in a male-dominated environment is that you become inured to it, you become accustomed to that environment. And so the balancing out, because she was also involved in lots of women's activities, in peace organisations, she had a whole range of things that she was working in. So in those, she was working largely with women. In the Union and later in the Labour Party, she was working largely with men. And I think that always affects how people behave and what the norms are that you conform to, because one woman can't change a culture.
And into the middle of all this, of course, suddenly we're in the First World War, and that put an awful lot of political causes on hold, as it were. Women's suffrage was kind of suspending its campaigning during that period. Up to a point. The Irish question was kind of put on hold as well. So there are a whole load of things that were paused. But she was also, as you mentioned, a pacifist. And that didn't go down awfully well during the First World War. Ramsay MacDonald got into awful trouble.
He did.
Over this as well. So how did that play out?
Well, it's hard to remember now that Ramsay MacDonald came out of the First World War as a hero of the left because of his stand against the war. And he resigned the chairmanship of the Parliamentary Labour Party, which was effectively the leader of the party at that time, in order to campaign against the party's policy from the backbenches, and yet retained the whip. And so...
It would never happen now.
No. And so Margaret Bondfield decided that war and violence were incompatible with her values. That's one reason why, obviously, she was not going to be involved with the suffragette element of the suffrage movement, because she opposed their tactics on moral grounds as well as on tactical grounds. So when the war came, people had to decide what their position was. She and many women decided that they were against it. There had been before the war an international movement of women in all sorts of international women's suffrage societies, international women's trade organisations and so on. And there was a women's conference, huge women's conference organised at The Hague in 1915. There was a lot of toing and froing over whether or not the government were going to allow any British women to attend this, and eventually they agreed to a delegation of 12, and of which Bondfield was one. And they got to Tilbury to find that Churchill had closed the shipping lanes for the duration of the conference. And so they just had to sit there and wait and then go back to London and miss the whole conference. And the only British presence were women who had already been abroad. So women who were in the United States, British women in the United States got there. And for most of the British population, whether they agreed with the war or not, thought that it should be supported in order to support the men who were fighting it. People who opposed it were absolute anathema. In Ramsay MacDonald's case, what we would now call the tabloid press, went and dug out his birth certificate and published it. And of course he didn't go round saying, I am illegitimate, but that's how most people found out when his birth certificate was published. And obviously humiliating and infuriating, and not at all the sort of thing that the modern press would do.
Surely not. Surely not.
But it does just show there's nothing original in the way in which...
Yeah. One of the things that does strike me about the book, and also about when you read biographies of other women, prominent women in this period, whether it's, as you say, in the pacifist movement or the women's movement, is the sheer scale of their contacts overseas and how much international travel they do, giving speeches, lectures and so on, attending conferences. I'm just sort of struck when I think about politicians today. They don't seem to me to have the same number, the sheer scale of international contacts and do the kind of international travel with sister organisations that they used to do 100 years ago. And yet communications and travel is so much easier. And it's a very odd contrast. But she had enormous contacts. I mean, later in life, she's travelling to America regularly, travelling to Canada. She meets Eleanor Roosevelt on a regular basis. Frances Perkins, the Minister of Labour in the Roosevelt government in the Second World War. Enormous contacts.
She did. And they all did. Everybody knew everybody. There were different circles. So there was the peace movement circle. There were trade union circles. So a lot of her friends in the United States were women involved in trade unionism or grassroots organising, all that kind of level of activism. But she also knew, she knew people in governments. She wasn't only involved in women's organisations, she also represented either the Labour Party or the Union or the TUC or the country at international conferences of all kinds, particularly immediately after the First World War. She knew people in revolutionary Russia.
Yeah.
And that was a particularly striking section of the book, actually, where she goes to Lenin's Russia, the Bolsheviks fairly newly in power. And she's
not overly impressed.
Well, she's not overly impressed, largely because the sort of iron fist with which Lenin is ruling and quashing any kind of dissent at all.
Yes. But then she goes into the Checkers headquarters and says, the secret police's headquarters, and says, what are you doing? Why are you killing people? It's not quite what you would think of somebody like her as doing, but she was very focused. If she had a job to do, she was going to go and do that job. But she also acquired friends while she was there who lasted for as long as possible in the circumstances, and she retained curiosity. So even when in the late 30s she was in Mexico, one of the things she did was to go and see Trotsky, just to see what he was now like.
But not just go and see Trotsky. She goes and sees Trotsky at the home of Frida Kahlo, the artist, and Diego Rivera, which is a whole different level of glamour.
Yes. I don't think she met them. I don't think they were there because they'd lent the house to Trotsky. But every corner you turn, there is somebody that you think, oh, that person's really interesting. Perhaps I need to go and find out about them. There is a much bigger book to be written about it, but there's also a book I think, to be written about that whole networking that women did at that time that we just don't think of at all. It's
What financed it? I mean, where did the money come from?
if you were going on behalf of your organisation, obviously they were going to pay. When she went, certainly the initial visits to America, they were lecture tours or more standing on street corners and shouting at people tours. Yes, she went to help trade unions there recruit. So there was a lot of meetings outside factories and so on and so forth. And you took a collection at all the meetings and that was how you got paid. So if you had a good day, you would eat, and if you'd lost your voice, you wouldn't. And in the early days, it was that stark.
So it's that risk element, isn't it?
Yes.
You're going across and you're not quite sure how it's all going to come together. It's
Exactly.
quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Now, the war ends, and the war has broken the old Liberal Party of Asquith and Lloyd George.
Yep.
And a political space is opening up for the Labour Party politically to take over as the opposition to the Tories. And at some point, Margaret Bondfield makes the jump from the kind of trade union track of the Labour movement to the political track and wants to become an MP. How did that happen?
I've thought about this quite a lot, and I'm still not quite clear why she didn't stand in 1918 when women were first able to stand for Parliament. Her friend Mary MacArthur did, and Margaret Bondfield spent the campaigning for MacArthur. A small number of other Labour women did, and there's no record of her seeking selection anywhere or anybody, commenting on it. So she can't have wanted to do it at that stage, and I have no idea why not, because it seems such an obvious next step. By 1920, she'd obviously dealt with whatever she needed to do, and she started standing in by-elections in Northampton. There was about a by-election a week in those days because...
The good old days.
I exaggerate slightly. If an MP got appointed to a payroll job, there had to be a by-election. And lots of people got in by-elections rather than general elections. She stood in Northampton in 1920, failed against a Liberal. Stood in 1922 election, failed, stood in 1923 and got in. So I don't know why she didn't do it earlier, because she would certainly, for most people at that time, have been an obvious candidate. And possibly where Mary MacArthur stood, she had the advantage. She stood in the constituency where the trainmakers' strike had been, so she had an obvious advantage of being known. But Margaret Bondfield was very well known by that stage. She would have been a high-profile candidate, so...
And what was the mood in the Labour Party in those days? Did they see themselves as a kind of wedge trying to get into Parliament, or did they see themselves as tooling up to be a party of government?
Ramsay MacDonald saw them as a party of government, and he and Keir Hardie, before the war, had always been quite clear that if they could remove the Liberal Party, they would be in, and that it would be difficult but possible. And it's a curious mindset when you think of the landslides that there were in the decades before the war, to be sitting there with your tiny little party thinking, oh yeah, but we can sort this out and we'll be in. But that is what they thought. And so Ramsay MacDonald always had a very clear view of what needed to happen and what the strategy should be, and when he thought it necessary, he did deals with the Liberals, and when not, he fought them all the way. I think most other people just took the view of let's get some people elected and see what happens and see where we go. And I don't think that anybody other than a handful of people seriously expected them to be in government in 1924. Because if you think it happened, but if you think about it, you're founded in 1900 and you're in government in 1924 is a considerable...
Yeah, it's a hell of a leap. But there she is in a bunch of people there, and suddenly there's a Labour government. What's her role? Everybody
assumed that she would be in the cabinet, and the papers were full of speculation about her being Minister of Health, or Health and Housing, as it was then. That was a newish ministry. It covered a lot of the issues that obviously she was interested in. But she had been very opposed to a coalition, and publicly opposed to a coalition. And so I imagine the Liberals said no.
It was Ramsay MacDonald's first government. He needed at least the consent of the Liberals too.
Yes, and he had Liberals in the government, and I think they just said no. And so she became the junior minister, the parliamentary secretary. There were only 2 ministers per ministry at the time. So she became the junior minister in the Ministry of Labour, which actually played better to her skills and her knowledge, because she had been involved with the development of the welfare system, for want of a better phrase, and since its inception in the People's Budget in 1910 and its development in 1911 and 12. And she was very familiar with it. She knew how it worked. She understood the principles of it. She had quite clear thoughts about how it should be reformed, which I'm sure we'll come on to. So she was a round peg in a round hole. And unfortunately, the cabinet minister she was working for wasn't.
This is Tom Shaw.
This is Tom Shaw, who had been put in and who didn't have her breadth and depth of understanding, and it became embarrassing in the end because it was so clear that she was so much better than he was at the job.
She's one of these ministers whose job is to follow their boss around with a bucket and spade, so
Yes,
to speak. Yeah.
Yes. There was one point where they were the opposition were trying to cut Tom Shaw's salary. Tom Shaw made his case, and they got up and said, well, you should have sent Miss Bondfield. She'd have done a better job of defending him.
Talk about the parliamentary side for a minute before we head further into the ministerial work. So she's part of a large number of new MPs, but a small number of new female MPs. What was that experience like for them? I mean, this small group of women, there's basically one room available for them, there's a lack of toilets, just basic facilities are not there. But the sort of the culture that they're going into. So she's not just learning the ministerial ropes, she's also got to learn the parliamentary ropes.
Yes, she got elected at the beginning of December 1923, and she was made a minister in the middle of January 1924. And they weren't sworn in until January, because it took a long time to sort out what was going to happen with the government. So they were all literally pitched into both jobs at the same time with no idea, basically, of where they were or what they were doing. And it's amazing they survived 10 months when you think about it. There were 3 Labour women, Susan Lawrence and Dorothy Jewson, very different women, and then there were a handful of women from other parties, and Parliament took the view that all women were basically the same, didn't have any politics, so they had one room for the ladies, and it was a fairly small room opening off the terrace, not where Strangers is, but along that part of the terrace. There was an iron and an ironing board eventually.
No typecasting there then.
No space for secretaries or facilities to deal with correspondence or any of that. And obviously Margaret Bondfield could use the union's facilities to deal with her parliamentary correspondence, and Nancy Astor had her own arrangements. But the basic tenor of Parliament was, here is the inconvenience of women, where can we put them where we won't notice them? There were 8 of them in total, I think. And they did tend to have projects that they worked on as a group, cross-party group of women. There were, when they first got in, there were lots of events to honour the new women MPs and little dinners, and father of the house gave a little dinner for the ladies, and there's a nice photograph of him, T.P. O'Connor I think it was, standing there very pleased and the women sitting around him. There was a sort of recognition that there was a change of gear almost, but no idea of what to do about it. And of course the same was true in the ministry when she got there.
I mean, Nancy Astor was kind of the doyen of the women MPs at the time, as the first one to arrive, and she seemed to think quite highly of Margaret Bondfield.
Yes, they got on quite well, and stayed in touch long after either of them was in Parliament. And Nancy Astor could be very difficult, and her politics was certainly nowhere near Margaret Bondfield's, but because they were forced together, and this applies to all of the women, they had to consider each other in a different light from the way in which the men did, because they were literally sharing space and could not avoid one another. I think also, on one level, people were more ideologically rooted, but on another they were more open to one another's humanity.
And what do the media make of all of this? Because there's a sort of wonderful story right at the start where they're, the women are arriving in Parliament. They're expected to wear hats, and certainly Margaret Bondfield takes her hat off before getting into the chamber. So she takes the oath bareheaded, and this is a bit of a media
intake of breath.
media controversy. And there's quite a lot of comment early on in her parliamentary career about she's not a great speaker in the chamber because she's used to shouting at public meetings, and she has to sort of work on that.
She could make herself heard without artificial amplification in the Albert Hall. But the chamber of the House of Commons was
smaller.
A bit trickier.
Much smaller.
Yeah, there was that. It took her a while to adjust her speaking style. I don't think she was ever a great House of Commons speaker. I think she became competent and able and not intimidated by it, but I don't think she would ever count as one of the great Commons speakers. The press was just in a state of just the whole idea. When there was speculation about her being a cabinet minister, somebody wrote a whole piece about when cabinet ministers are sworn in as privy councillors, they have to wear court dress with white satin knee breeches. What will Miss Bondfield look like in white satin knee breeches? Miss Bondfield is a very charming woman, but there's a lot of this sort of nonsense. The hats thing is a political decision and a feminist decision, because the wearing of a hat, the covering of the head in a religious space, which of course the House of Commons technically, as it originated in St Stephen's Chapel, still has the layout of the nave of a church. And women always wore hats. The few women that there had been there, but Nancy Astor had very early taken the view that you stand out as little as possible. So you wear a hat, which is what is expected, and a dark suit and so on and so forth. And all three of the Labour women actually removed their hats at the door because they were not prepared to accept that they were inferior to the men there, because they were representing the people of Britain in the same way as everybody else was. And then there was a big ruckus about it, and Nancy Astor said, "Oh, this is a big mistake, you shouldn't do this." But the Duchess of Atholl said, "Oh, if they don't, I won't." Took her hat off and said exactly that. I'm quite happy to be respectful in where it's appropriate, but I think in the House of Commons, and anyway, hats are heavy and I don't want to wear one. So that sort of knocked women wearing hats on the head. But she also refused to wear a hat when she was sworn in as Privy Councillor in 1929. There was a bit of a to and a fro between her and the palace about that.
And that wasn't the only controversy of its kind that was generated when she became a cabinet minister and a right honourable in 1929. This astounding memo has to be written about her gender.
The gender of the minister. Well, by law, this is not the case now because we managed to change it some years ago, but by law, ministers were always referred to in legislation as he. So when she became a minister, what then do? We have to refer to her as he in the legislation because we're not going to have primary legislation to change that. But she's not a he. Visibly not a he. So what do we do about this? And it went to the ministry's solicitor, who then had to write a memo called The Gender of the Minister, who thought it would be positively painful, his words, not mine, to have to refer to her as she, and so proposed that it should be he. And this landed on her desk for a decision, and I think she just thought, oh, for goodness sake. And
bigger
therefore
bigger
she's
problems to deal with.
And therefore she is he in all the parliamentary documents.
I suppose we can smirk at this 100 years on, but at the time, the arrival of women in the boys' club of government was really quite a shocking thing.
It did require legislation to change ministers being he. So all women ministers, I can't remember off the top of my head now when that actually was changed, but it's a lot later than you think it would be. If only because there wasn't another female cabinet minister until Ellen Wilkinson in 1945.
Which is extraordinary when you think about it. I mean, 1924 and then again a bit later, which we'll come on to, but then you have to wait till 45. Yeah. Well, 1924, she takes office. What does she do? What's she in charge of?
She is in charge of a benefit system which was already in difficulties and had only been in existence for 11, 12 years. So we think of it as sort of this huge juggernaut of a thing, and it was becoming that, but it was very new. There were very few people who understood how it worked. There were lots of people who had ideas about how it should work, including her, but the problem, as always, was money. And they were past the post-war boom and into the post-war difficulties, and they knew they didn't have long. If they'd lasted a year, it would have been miraculous. So they knew they couldn't do anything root and branch. So the problem with that was going to be keeping it afloat, basically.
And Margaret Bonfield's views on how the benefit system should, as it was then, should function were, to a modern eye, actually quite small c conservative. She didn't want overly generous benefits that disincentivise work, for example, an argument that I think makes a lot of people uncomfortable in the Labour Party today.
Yes, and did then. But in the first place, a very different economic situation. Secondly, she always took the view that the benefit system was a safety net, not the first port of call. And it had been structured in such a way that it worked through a series of benefit societies. So the state didn't administer the whole of the system. Benefit societies administered the system, and the unions were all benefit societies because they'd all had benefit clubs of one kind or another. And so when the first national insurance schemes and so on came in, they were able to register as benefit societies and then be paid by the government to administer. So it was much more complicated in terms of who the stakeholders, what we would now call the stakeholders in it, were, than now when it's provided very differently. She also took the view that it should be on a proper insurance basis and not what we call national insurance, which actually isn't insurance, and she thought it should be put onto proper actuarial principles. But she knew she wasn't going to achieve that as a junior minister in a very short-lived government, and she also had responsibility for post-war industrial training, particularly for women and girls. She got into trouble because she wanted to train girls for domestic service on the grounds that women were always going to go into domestic service and therefore it should be properly recognised as a skill. Running a domestic setup should be regarded as a skill and people should be properly trained for it, and if they were properly trained for it they should be properly paid for it. Middle class women's organisations went up the wall. Working class women thought, the training centres she set up were all oversubscribed, and because of a very different view of what domestic work was. And Margaret Bondfield was certainly guilty of having a very Victorian view of motherhood and domesticity and so on.
And yet was one of the least domestic people I can imagine of that time.
She didn't do housework. She hated it. She couldn't cook, no. There's the thing when she was 75 and she finally decided, well, perhaps I'd better learn. Very pleased with herself for having baked a pie that lasted 4 days, but it didn't last more than a couple of weeks, the cooking, and she never did housework if she could possibly avoid it. But she always said, well, then I have more regard for people who do.
Now, we touched on this right at the beginning of this conversation, that she's in the cabinet in Ramsay MacDonald's second Labour government, which comes to power just as the Great Crash is happening and tipping into the Great Depression. We talk about the current government having had a pretty poor economic inheritance was as nothing to what the Ramsay MacDonald administration had to face. An absolutely disastrous situation that they had somehow to try and struggle to deal with. And she was the Secretary of State for Labour.
She was, and Philip Snowden described it as the worst job in government. And that's because it was.
Philip Snowden was the Chancellor of the Exchequer at that time.
Yes, yes, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and then he proceeded to make it as difficult as it could be.
Another minister with very conventional, even Victorian economic views, I suppose.
And also regarded as, Philip Snowden's the economic genius of the party, and even actual economic geniuses didn't know what to do when faced with a completely unprecedented situation. She took over at a point where the National Insurance Fund was virtually bankrupt, and then after the Wall Street crash was actually bankrupt. So there was no money. The unions refused to entertain any cuts. The bankers and financiers refused to lend any money unless there were cuts. There were employers who thought that the way through was to abolish the whole thing and go back to charity provision. Nobody actually knew what to do. Unemployment at one point was going up by 100,000 a month. And she was in the middle trying to keep this thing afloat, unable to please anybody, without any allies, basically. MacDonald just withdrew because he didn't understand any of it. and there's a note in his diary about, "We are baffled by unemployment." And you're thinking, well, oh dear, that doesn't bode well.
And these tensions basically broke the Labour government and the Labour Party.
Yes.
MacDonald's solution to this in the end was to let his government fall and the national government took over. I
have a slightly different interpretation of that. There was massive public demand for a national government and a lot of pressure from the King for a national government. And MacDonald had to choose whether or not to head it up because he was the Prime Minister of the time. And he thought, rightly or wrongly, that it was his duty to do that. And a tiny number of ministers followed him in that, and the rest didn't. What he also promised to the party was that in the inevitable general election, there would not be a government coupon as there had been in 1918 when Lloyd George's coalition government effectively authorised candidates from different parties to be the official government candidate. And MacDonald said he would not do that. And so on the basis of that promise, the party didn't expel him at that point because most of the individuals thought, we will get through this and then we'll all come back together again. Because this has happened before. The Labour Party had been sort of swirling around and splitting. Think of MacDonald and others going to the backbenches in the First World War and then leading the party immediately after. They were the same generation and used to this idea of we go different in different directions and then we come back. But he reneged on that promise. And it was a coupon
So
election.
There were kind of official national government
candidates.
There
were national government candidates.
Running against official Labour candidates.
And that's at the time, that's what people felt bitterly betrayed by. Because, of course, the electorate wanted a national government and voted for it. And Labour lost 200 seats and was reduced to pre-war levels of representation. And the inability to forgive that has got mixed up with the whole issue of the national government. And of course there were people who bitterly objected to the national government, but one of the things we have to remember from that is that the electorate sided with MacDonald. He wasn't the villain of the piece to the electorate. He may have been mistaken, and he was certainly wrong to renege on that promise. But when you read Margaret Bonfield's account of that period, both in her archive and in her book, it's clear that that's the element that she was really bitter about. And the national government was a series of political decisions that she understood and even empathised with, but couldn't follow, couldn't join in with.
In those last months of the government, she takes the unemployment insurance bill through, which becomes known as the Anomalies Act. This is what also a lot of the criticism internally and this difference of opinion within the party is about. You've got this economic crisis, you've got growing unemployment, you've got pressure on the insurance system. And she's driving through a bill to create savings on the insurance by excluding, for example, seasonal workers and married women from eligibility. So inevitably she gets a lot of personal criticism as a result of that. I was very struck, in those sort of final days, the Cabinet discussed 10% cuts to essentially the welfare system in an hour in Cabinet.
Yes.
Pretty quick. But so this is also part of the underlying issue at the heart of the government. For her, as a political activist and as a trade unionist, incredibly difficult to be presiding over a welfare system that you're cutting.
Especially when you were involved in setting it up.
Yeah.
It was soul-destroying. I think it was soul-destroying for all of them, but I think particularly for her because she knew that her reputation would be very damaged by it. She knew she couldn't put it right. There was no lever you could pull, to use modern terminology, that would somehow magic up the money or
just bad choices,
make it different. There were a series of choices. Some of the ones she made were right, some of the ones she made weren't, and some of them are inexplicable to us now, but not unreasonable in this. So the married women's one, that we go, what? At the time, the whole question of married women and work was still a thing, and the unions, the manual unions in particular, were still campaigning for a family wage. So in the context of the time, it makes more sense than it does now. It was still a bad choice.
And it was a bad choice in the end that helped cost her seat. So she was one of the 200 MPs who lost.
All the women lost. There were 9 Labour women MPs by that point. They all lost. Her result was actually better than many of them. She didn't lose by a lot. She was the first, because, first at almost everything, so she was the first woman to lose to another woman. It was the first election in which all the candidates were women. She certainly lost, but it was not, when you read the correspondence around it, it was certainly not viewed as hopeless, and there was an assumption that she would get it back in the next election, whenever that turned out to be 35, and she didn't. But certainly in 1931, there wasn't a feeling of, oh, this is terrible, this is terminal, that's the end of your career. And she then went back to working for her union, which by then was the GMB. And so even the idea that she terminally fell out with the unions is not true, because she then went and worked for the GMB, or NUGMW as it was then, until her retirement.
She never returns to Parliament, that's it.
She never returns to Parliament. By the time she lost her seat, she was nearly 60, which nowadays is nothing, but then was different. She stood in 1935 in Wallsend, but it was an uphill struggle. She was up against a very good Tory MP who stayed there for years and years and years. Obviously, the 1940 election didn't happen, but she was adopted by Reading for the 1940 election because her agent moved there and said, do you want a seat nearer London?
She did.
Basically, I think. Yeah, exactly what he did. So she had every intention, but I think when that didn't happen, she wasn't that sorry. And, that was the end of that. And a younger, the focus had shifted. The focus was on Ellen Wilkinson and the next generation of younger women MPs coming through. Most of her contemporaries, a number of them died during the 30s or had themselves retired. And I think, with hindsight, she wasn't going to get back in. But I can see why she thought she would at the time.
There's the kind of aftertaste of her reputation, if you like. There she was, the first woman cabinet minister. In many ways, she should be a towering figure, but actually her reputation's a lot more ambiguous than that.
Yes.
And a lot of people did not see her as an example to be emulated. Future women ministers did not want to be Margaret Bondfield.
Well, Barbara Castle did not want to be Margaret Bondfield. Ellen Wilkinson was very generous to her and wrote, when she became a cabinet minister, wrote her a very generous letter thanking her for everything she'd done for women in politics. There weren't very many other cabinet ministers to take that view until Barbara Castle. I think Barbara Castle was the third Labour cabinet minister. So now Barbara Castle had been young when Margaret Bondfield was in government, and her generation took the view that Margaret Bonfield's generation had been a block to progress, and, you know, the usual generational divide that you get at points of change in political parties. And so when Barbara Castle became a cabinet minister herself, obviously her first point of reference is going to be Margaret Bondfield. But when young Barbara Castle was a member of the Labour Club at Oxford, obviously followed it all intently, obviously very angry about everything that was happening and all the rest of it. However, it's also worth saying that Barbara Castle unveiled the commemorative plaque to Margaret Bondfield in Chard in the early 80s. So what her actual opinion was, I don't know. And I suspect that her experience in government, particularly with the unions and her attempt to get in place of strife through, may have made her more sympathetic to the troubles that Margaret Bondfield had. I think because it's women about women, we tend to be very one-dimensional about how we view what people say. It's also true, in Margaret Bonfield's defence, that historians have not served her well, and where they have been misquoted. The one that often annoys me is in the Dictionary of Labour History, where Marion Miliband wrote the entry for Margaret Bondfield. And he's always quoted as saying, I can't remember the exact words, but Margaret Bondfield was out of her depth. True. But the actual sentence reads, like all her cabinet colleagues, Margaret Bondfield was out of her depth.
And Margaret Bondfield acknowledged this, didn't she? 'Cause
Yes.
particularly after the 1924 government, she basically says, we were buried under paper.
Yeah.
So much reading material, so much, information and documents being produced within the department and across government. We just couldn't really get on top of it. Having to learn parliamentary rules in the House of Commons, having to deal with all these sort of new issues that they'd never dealt with before. So they've got the pressures of government, they've got the pressures of the House of Commons, and they've got this sort of wider international economic pressure that's on their shoulders. And she acknowledges it's just incredibly difficult. And interestingly, she basically concludes that they had a lack of focus, that they were trying to do too much in too short a time. And if only they'd focused on a couple of things, they might have done better.
Yep.
Really fascinating.
Exactly it. And I think, in a way, I almost think 1924 must have been more difficult than 1929, because at least in 1929 they went into it with some idea of how the system worked.
Yeah.
Whereas in 1924 it was just, why am I here?
Yeah.
What are we doing? How do we do it?
Yeah, but the Barbara Castle analogy is really quite interesting, because when Barbara is offered the Ministry of Labour by Harold Wilson in Cabinet, she basically says to him, oh, no, I don't want that. I don't want to be Margaret Bondfield Mark II. And they have this sort of an interesting conversation that's reported in the diaries about, well, perhaps we should change the name of the department. And she suggests Ministry of Labour and Productivity. And he says, well, I don't really think that's going to work with a woman at the helm.
No.
All sorts of connotations. And that's where we get the Department for Employment emerges. But as you say, it struck me reading the book that all throughout there is this, maybe Barbara Castle perhaps didn't like the reputational link, but actually there's mirrors of it in place of strife and her own personal experience.
Absolutely. The personalities in politics change, all kinds of circumstances change, but the basic thrust of what people are trying to do doesn't change, and the difficulties that people can get into are broadly similar for the last century or so. It's variations on a theme, and it was very tempting when writing this book to draw more parallels than I have done, but they don't last They don't wear well, so I have refrained from doing that. But it is true that you can recognise the basic tension between the Treasury and the benefit system has existed when Lloyd George published the People's Budget in 1910 and exists now and will always exist, because it will always be a major spending department, and the Treasury will always want to limit spending.
Lots of really important lessons from the career of an unfortunately forgotten political figure. Nan Sloane, thanks very much indeed for joining Ruth and me on the pod today.
Thank you very much indeed. I've enjoyed it.
Thanks, Nan. And for listeners, if you want to get Nan's book, I certainly recommend it. It's Margaret Bondfield, The Life and Times of Britain's First Female Cabinet Minister, and it's published on the 19th of February by Bloomsbury.
Yes.
We'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks for joining us, Nan.
Thank you.
Parliament Matters is produced by the Hansard Society and supported by the Joseph Rowntree Charitable Trust. For more information, visit hansardsociety.org.uk/pm or find us on social media at Hansard Society.